I am James O'Barr, artist, writer of The Crow, and comic books aren't just things for movie companies to exploit.
Hey there, welcome to Sequentially Yours, Initially Mine. This is a show where we look at this week's number ones and tell you which ones will last forever and which ones are going to fade away. Oh, what a week. What a week. It wasn't as bad as last week. I will say that. It was not as bad as last week. But, man, did it try so hard to be. Let's just dive right in and get most of these out of the way, shall we? Alright. So, number one, all-time comics, Atlas. I see what they're trying to do here. Basically, they're trying to make a comic that looks like the old 4-color comics down to the kind of weird printing, the, not great quality, and the somewhat, direct, for lack of a better term, narrative. Everybody is kind of over the top and melodramatic, and I like the idea. The problem is that, well, to be perfectly honest, they decided that they were just going to go with just like the old stuff, but grittier and darker. Like, it's just not entertaining anymore. I mean, I guess it's entertaining to some people, but I sit there and I'm like, oh, wow. So the guy got burned alive in this otherwise Silver Agey 4-color comic. That is so edgy and hysterical and interesting and ooh, come on. I mean, seriously, what was going through your head? What made you sit there and say, hey, I know, let's do the stuff from before, only without the innocence or the camp? That's what we should do. That's the way to go. I just don't get it. I guess some people like this, but I can only imagine the people who are most going to be attracted to the, oh no, the girlfriend ends up being electrocuted to death by the villain who just showed up out of nowhere. To be continued. I can imagine the only people who are going to be entertained by that are going to be thrown off by the overuse of sort of tropes from that period, the weird narration, the multiple kid sidekicks. That was a thing. There's like 1,000 kid sidekicks in this. And none of them are actual sidekicks. It's just, hey, this is the person who is the friend of the secret identity or the stepson of the secret identity. And it just didn't work. I see what they were trying to do. And there was one part that I actually will say is really kind of interesting, in the sense that this particular superhero, his weakness is fear. And when they're showing him being afraid of things, the fear builds on itself. He starts to not just be afraid of what other people are thinking of him, but then draw in like specters of his parents being disappointed in him, and it's actually somewhat interesting to see that fear building on top of itself like that, and keeping him paralyzed. That was fascinating. But the rest of it just lacked any sort of imagination. It was like a 12-year-old was trying to make jokes here. And a 12-year-old can make jokes for other 12-year-olds, but this comic is not for 12-year-olds. It's very clearly not for 12-year-olds. It's for people in their 50s, or possibly in between their 30s and their 50s, let's say, that either read these as kids or have a love for that era of comic. But it's not going to attract that audience, so I don't know who this comic is written for. Whatever, just go away. Next. What do we got here? Hey, speaking of having no idea who a comic is made for, that's not true with this one. A Bulletproof Coffin one-shot 1,000-yard stare. This is made for old comic artists. It really is. It is made for old comic artists. It is not even remotely subtle about the fact that the artist, who is mediocre at best, does that weird art style that you see in Comedy Central cartoons from the 90s, like Dr. Katz and home movies. But while it sort of works in animation because you don't have time to really focus on it, in comic form, it just looks lazy and like they just kind of hit a bunch of places with the pen for no apparent reason. But we're supposed to love the comic artist who is dealing with the fact that he wrote a comic that's just as good as it was with his writer, and they sold out to Big Two. Not the Big Two, Big Two. But then Image Nation showed up and offered him an opportunity to make the comic that he wanted, and oh... Man, if I can't believe... It's basically just 30 pages of this guy masturbating to his own greatness and why nobody understands him. The character is not likable in any respect. He's not relatable in any respect unless you happen to be, somebody in that field and kind of understands sort of where he's coming from. In the end, he's at a comic convention complaining about how there's no dignity anymore, and everybody comes up to him and is so rude, and then somebody comes up dressed like his character, but he can't really hear him because of the mask, and thinks that his old writer come to attack him, so he shoots the guy, and it was his fan! His biggest fan! Oh... And then the writer shows up out of nowhere just to yell at him while he's being arrested and collect all of the works that are covered in the fan's blood because they're gonna sell like crazy. The cynicism on display here is so astonishing, so blatant, that I can only be sorry for the creator. What were you thinking? What could have possibly been going through your head here? Do you really think that people were going to look at this and understand this character, or like this character, or want to read about this character? I mean, I see why it's a one-shot, because I would never pick up another comic about this character again. He's not entertaining. He's just miserable. And if you want to share somebody's misery, then come subscribe to this channel. Because apparently the past couple of weeks, you're just going to get misery after misery from me. But otherwise, yeah. No, it's... whatever. Bah! Ugh. Alright. Next. Alright, I promise you that I'm front-loading all of the bad ones this week so that we can get to some of the good ones. Because now we have gotten The Divided States of Hysteria. This comic is so far up its ass, it can see through its own mouth. I don't even know how to begin to describe this. Yes, there's been a lot of controversy about this lately. So much so that the writer decided to put his own little rant in the back, which is hilarious, let me tell you. It just goes on and gets more and more incomprehensible the further along it goes. He gets in his blows about how nobody on either side understands him or what he's trying to say. Oh, man. Just stop. And this wasn't even like a response to people's response to his comic. He just threw that in there. Now, you know what? I'm not saying that he's a terrible human being. In fact, I will say that he is probably a very nice person. But trying to get ahead of this has just made it seem that much dumber. But I'm going to try, now that I've talked about that, I'm just going to talk about it as a comic. And it still fails. It basically goes from vignette to vignette, about these people who eventually get arrested for one thing or another, sometimes sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for false reasons. The artwork is kind of interesting in the sense that in the background you have a semi opaque what am I thinking of? Like social media windows and whatnots to imply that the CIA is spying on everybody and looking to see what's going on, which, okay, that's actually kind of an interesting idea. The problem is that these vignettes seem to have nothing to do with each other. And all of them are about about marginalized people getting arrested for one reason or another. The only character that we see that isn't arrested is the white dude who's cheating on his wife and apparently knows about a terrorist attack that's coming to Washington, D.C., but nobody will listen to him. I'm not sure whether this comic is supposed to be a parody or if it's supposed to be serious and it's poorly done. If it's a parody, it's poorly done too. But nothing about this makes sense. The narration box is talking about the main character, I think. Could be. We haven't really seen a whole lot of him, but the guy that is like perfect and knows everything, the Jack Bauer of this, I think his name is Frank. They are so over the top that I want to sit there and say, okay, this is a parody, but there aren't any elements of parody to it. And if it's trying to parody older style comics, there's nothing in this. No other tropes from those comics are available to it. I don't know where this was supposed to go or what the idea was. Maybe the author's right. Maybe I just don't get it. It's possible that he's brilliant and just so far beyond the ken of mortal beings that I just don't have any idea what's going on in this comic. But you know what? Make your statement when you're not trying to sell me a comic. Because I have no interest in reading any more of the United... or that thing. Whatever. Alright. We're starting to get into the good ones right now. Okay. So, next one. Magnus. Now, some of you might remember Magnus Robot Fighter. Started as a Gold Key comic way back in, I believe, the 70s. I could be wrong on that one. Gold Key then sold it to Valiant, and Magnus Robot Fighter was an important part of the Valiant universe for many years until they had to sell to Acclaim. Acclaim tried to keep it going for a while, didn't work, sold the character to Dark Horse, and now Dynamite, those collectors of licenses, has Magnus. Which, great. You know what? I like Magnus. And this appears to be a bit of a reboot. I like the concept behind it. Our main character is Dr. Magnus, robot therapist. She's a psychologist in this time around who works with robots. Essentially, robots realize that they're artificial and can't work with this, can't kind of parse this. They're artificial intelligences. Therefore, they are, for all intents and purposes, people. But they're people who are programmed to serve, but they also are conscious of that servitude, and it's an interesting idea. Suffice it to say, they created a place called the Cloud where they can essentially plug in, and it's a digital world that they can live in when they're not serving man. At the beginning of this, a robot says goodbye to his family in the Cloud and then goes to the real world and murders his owners. And some police come to Dr. Magnus to try to get her to go into the Cloud in order to retrieve him because he has to be held to trial. Otherwise, it could, blow up, and there's big political ramifications for this. It's an interesting concept. I like the thought. It was well executed. The writing's good. I think, was Chuck Wendig on this one? I think Chuck Wendig wrote this one. I'm gonna have to double check but no, Kyle Higgins. I apologize, Mr. Higgins. I know Wendig did one of the comics this time around. I just don't know which one. But yeah, no, Mr. Higgins, well done. It's exciting. I'm kind of curious to see what happens next. I want to follow this character. Another kind of cool thing is that there's a Turok backup story in it. Now, one problem here is that both of these stories draw at least some elements from another Dynamite book called Sovereign. And number one is not a place where you want to have stuff crossing over from other things. I'm not tempted to buy those things. I want a book that I don't have to have read another book to get. For the most part, the Magnus story I could. The Turok story is literally part 2 of, I think, 3. So I have no idea how Turok is where he is or what has changed from the character that I'm familiar with. Now, here's something interesting. Turok originally was introduced as a backup to Magnus Robot Fighter 4000. It was then sold to Valiant, and Turok became a Valiant character, went to Acclaim, and now Dynamite picked up Turok as well. Turok Dinosaur Hunter was probably the most famous version of it. So at least there's that, and I think that's kind of a cool thing that they're throwing their Turok story as a backup to Magnus again. I'd read this one again. I'd read number 2. I want to see what happens. Otherwise, yeah, that's it for Magnus. Alright, next one. Mighty Mouse. I joked with my wife beforehand that everything seems so cynical this week that Mighty Mouse is probably going to give up the general superheroing and become a gun-toting Punisher-style vigilante. And while that didn't happen, this is definitely a different take on the story. It's not bad. But it's what I guess you could do with Mighty Mouse. In fact, if you need a little reminder of Mighty Mouse, hold on a second. I'll be right back.
Mr. Trouble never hangs around when he hears this mighty sound. Here I come to save the day. I think the mighty mouse is on the way. Yes, sir, when there is a wrong to right, mighty mouse will join the fight. On the sea or on the land, he gets the situation well in hand.
And that's Mighty Mouse. Basically, the main character is a kid named Joey, human kid, who lives in our world and loves Mighty Mouse. But otherwise, he's poor. His mother has to work 2 jobs to pay for things, so he's often alone. He's being bullied. There's a homeless dude living on his stoop. And Mighty Mouse is his way of escaping. And then at the end of the book, Mighty Mouse comes into the real world, and presumably the book is going to be, the 2 of them sort of learning from each other and whatnot. So it's mostly about a kid in a terrible situation. So it has that cynical element to it, but at the very least, it's also about how we use hope to push ourselves forward and to escape our world and to become better people. And I'm okay with that. I can live with nothing. I can like a world that is imperfect and characters who are not in a good place. I can enjoy something like that while still, as long as it is pressing towards something other than the world is terrible. I want something more than nihilism in my comics. And that's what so many comics this week have, and that's what Mighty Mouse manages to sidestep by making it about how you overcome that. So, yeah, Mighty Mouse was good. Try reading it. It's pretty good. All right. We've gotten to our number 1 for the week. This took me by surprise, particularly because I follow the author on Twitter, and I guess I just missed his updates on it. But you know what? Donny Cates' Baby Teeth is actually pretty good. I think what I like most about it is that the characters are believable. It starts with a woman talking into a phone, trying to record something, and this dialogue that she has, I buy into it. It seems like something that a real person would be saying and doing. It feels, I can put myself in that scene. The framing device works. The other characters that are introduced, they could be so over the top and so stereotypical and just fall into certain categories, and they don't. Instead, we get a pretty good story about characters who are struggling with something, and one of them may or may not have given birth to the Antichrist. Sure. I'll go for that. I'm kind of interested to see what happens next. The to be continued aspect of it worked. It worked really well, actually, because it gave us just enough information at the end that it added a mystery. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Comic book number 1 ought to have a story that we can follow beginning to end, and then give us a hook at the end. If you try to write a story that is 1 of 4 parts in your number 1 comic, it's almost certainly not going to work. It's just the way it is, unless these are established characters in, like, the big 2. And even then, look at Mosaic. Mosaic is an interesting concept, but from issue number 1, it started, I believe, a 6 or 7 part arc. And quite frankly, by number 1, I wasn't hooked enough on this character that I cared to follow through for 7, 8 issues. It's just a lot of work for one thing. So instead, this tells us how the baby that is being spoken to was born. That is the story that we're getting. And then at the end, it's the Antichrist bit is dropped on us, and there's a pullback reveal of where this person is recording, and that's interesting as well. And these are enough of a hook to drag me into the second book. The characterization in general, again, is phenomenal. The artwork is great. I really like this artwork. It is just simplistic and minimalist enough that you're not that distracted by everything happening around the characters, but it also has the kinds of backgrounds that give you a feeling of being in a world. It's a very, very fine line to walk, and this comic does it really well. There's not much more I can say about it without getting too deep in the weeds, but yeah, Baby Teeth was good and is interesting, and I'm probably going to add it to my pull list because I want to see what happens next. Alright, so there's our comics for the week. Let's take a look at the oddly incongruous theme. This week's oddly incongruous theme is Cars from 1980. Like, I'm not kidding. Cars from 1980. There's some of them are pretty obvious. Like, for example, in the Atlas comic, one thing I will say is good about that. I'm sorry, I completely missed it. One thing is good is that it has a lot of, like, the advertisements, including, like, video game advertisements and toy advertisements that used to be in those types of comics. And they all look very much like them. But one of them is talking about another hero that's supposedly in the same universe, and he drives a 1980 Charger. And then in Baby Teeth, the main character's sister drives an 80 Bronco, and there are 1980 cars in background scenes in other books. And why 1980 and why cars? I couldn't tell you, but kind of everything but Mighty Mouse this week. Alright. I think that's about it, so I will see you all next week. Keep loving comics and take care.